Good evening and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I'll be discussing the formation and propagation of the supersonic shock wave in Wavefront. So what I've done is create a little hack program here which we're going to run, and this simulates or models both the muzzle blast and the supersonic shock waves, and collectively the shock wavefront. In this program, what I've done is stepped through the creation of the shock wavefront by individually displaying what the bullet would produce along its path. And the concept is to create the conic wavefront that we commonly refer to as the shock wavefront. The bullet travels along its path, and at every point along that path it creates a new little bitty shock wave, and collectively these shock waves form the wavefront. So let's take a look here. This is at very close resolution. I've already done two steps. The yellow sphere represents the muzzle blast, and it'll stay stationary. And as the bullet moves to the right, in the first step we emit one shock wave. Okay? And both the shock wave and the muzzle blast as spheres will just expand out. Ever expanding spheres is the key here. But since the bullet is moving to the right continually, at the next increment of time it will produce another little sphere. So let's do that. Yes, so now we've got three spheres. And you'll notice now that the muzzle blast has overtaken or collided with a portion of this first shock wave. So if we had an observer, say right there where the red dot is, then it would have recorded an encounter with both the muzzle blast and that first shock wave at the same time. So the time of arrival between the two is identical, and therefore the lag, which is defined as the difference between the two, is 0. Make sense? Alright, so let's erase our little observer there and put an observer out here, right in the path. Alright, and let's see when the first shock wave gets there, or this wavefront, and it'll just be right along the path, and how long it takes for the muzzle blast to arrive. So another step. Well, it already arrived. So a recorder at this position will now have recorded the impact with this shock wave. Now we haven't said anything about the shock wavefront. We're talking about individual shock waves. And you'll notice that the muzzle blast sphere out here still has a ways to go before it reaches that same position. So in this case, the arrival of the shock wave will be recorded, and then sometime later the arrival of the muzzle blast. Since we're still relatively close to, let's mark the origin of the whole thing, which is right here. That's the origin, or the tip of the gun. Still relatively close to that, then the lag, or the difference in the time of arrival between the shock wave and the muzzle blast will be relatively small. You can't really tell on this because I've magnified in on the first step, but this would represent, maybe 2 or 3 feet maximum. I think I've got the increment set to 1 foot of travel to the right for the bullet. So in that case, it would be 1, 2, 3, about 4 feet out. And let's see, the edge of the muzzle wave would be somewhere along in here, which means that it still has this distance to go, which would be about, I don't know, let's see, 1, 2, not quite 3 units of time. So the lag in this case would be 3 units of time which, since they each represent 1 foot, it would be 3 feet over whatever the speed of sound was. So if it were 1,000 feet per second, or no, the speed of the bullet. No, wait a minute. Speed of sound, that's right. So in this case, we have 3 foot of difference between the muzzle sphere and the shock wave. And that distance, since this muzzle sphere is traveling in all directions at the speed of sound, traveling is a bad word, but I use it from time to time. We have 3 foot to cover. If the speed of sound were 1,000 feet per second, that would be 3 milliseconds. So we'd have a lag of 3 milliseconds. All right. So these are all close things. All right, so let's take a couple more steps here. And we can already see that there's a pattern forming along here, but it's not quite clear what's happening. But as you can see, these individual shockwave spheres are interacting with each other in a way, and I'm going to have to shrink it down, in a way which, after a few of them together, it starts to become a pretty regular pattern. That is, this line, right here, which represents the edge of that sphere on both sides, is the shock wavefront, shock cone wavefront. And we can rotate this whole body around and see that it's the same on each side as a cone. And this is what is referred to as the conic shape of the supersonic shock wave. And of course I can't quite get it back to the way it was, but what's new? Alright, so here in this example we have the bullet traveling along this path, which is the axis of the cone. Okay, and the bullet right at the moment is right here at the tip of the cone. And as long as the bullet continues to move, it will produce new shock waves. It produced another one. Okay, and it will continue to produce them, And the bullet traveling faster than the speed of sound is outpacing the muzzle blast over here. And this is what creates the lag. Now, all situations are not quite as simple as this one. Okay. So, if we were to put an observer here, let's say out here. I do have to write. Yeah, there we go. Put an observer out here. Then, as the bullet goes by, and at some point in the future, the shock wave front will encounter that position. And so now the lag, which is the difference in time of the arrival of the supersonic shock wave and the muzzle blast, is still a ways. So because you can see with this example and with almost all of them, the shock wave arrives first, followed sometime later by the muzzle blast, unless the position of the object is such that they both arrive at the same time. So somewhere over in here, it would be a situation where they'd both arrive at the same time and the lag would be 0. So, ignoring my little markups there, if we continue to let this thing roll, then I'm going to have to make it really, really small because it's going to get big quick. Way big. Better stop it here. Slow down, Bumpy. Alright. And let's make it so that we can see it go to the right. Now, by the time I was able to stop it, the intensity of the cone and of the muzzle blast head diminished substantially. I make the loudness or the intensity proportional to the intensity of light here on a logarithmic scale, but it still doesn't accurately model the real thing. But as you can see now, the the entire thing is almost exclusively the leading cone of that bullet, which will continue to go, expand, and the bullet as it travels away from the center or where the gun was fired. So let's stop that program and rerun it and see what happens when the bullet doesn't make it all the way, because there were a few questions today that I needed to answer in the last video, and this little puppy can explain it quite readily. Alright, so once again, if I zoom way in here and do one step, alright, now in this case what we're going to do is we're going to let it go for 4 steps, and then the bullet hits something. And since the bullet hits something, it can no longer produce these individual shock waves. And so the cone essentially stops developing, and the already produced shock waves do their thing, as does the muzzle blast, and it starts to lose that nice pointedness to the front of the cone, and after a while it becomes dominated by in this case the muzzle blast and the front of that, and it's just becomes one kind of amorphous blob. Now you still see that there is some leftover part of that cone here, as this is the wavefront still propagating outward in a cone, and the front of the cone is a straight line, even if it's at some angle relative to the observer. So this is the case when the bullet stops, but the sounds have already been produced, so they have a life of their own. So just because a bullet hits something doesn't mean that sound goes away. It just means that the bullet stops producing new shock waves. And along this path there are, depending upon how far the bullet has traveled and its speed, there are billions of little shock waves that all got together and produced one nice cone. Now, depending upon the intensity of the shock wave, i.e. how loud it is, and the intensity of the background sound, how loud it is, that will determine how far away the shock wave can be heard. Myth has it that you can only hear it 200 feet away, but that myth was derived from the original researcher, a guy by the name of Whitham. He did a lot of research in fluid dynamics and came up with a lot of the formulas for the supersonic shock wave and the wavefront and all the parameters associated with it. And he observed that once the shock wave had left the bullet trajectory and traveled a certain distance, that the shape of the wave changed enough that it could no longer be relied upon for accurate measurements. That is, each one of those little spheres, when it's recorded, will produce something that we call an N wave. And if this is your electronic recording, it'll come along across like this, and then as the shock wave hits the observer or the recording device, it'll rise sharply to a high overpressure, and then it'll come down to a large underpressure, and then it'll arrive back up to normal with maybe a few oscillations, and then taper off. And this is called the N wave. And if you have a really good recorder, which means 5 times or 10 times better than your average man on the street recorder and 100 times better than the cop cams, then you can accurately capture this wave. But since the recorders aren't real accurate, it kind of distorts it. But if you had a really accurate recorder, what Whitham said was that at distances different as the wave, well, let me draw a line here. We got this bullet path, okay, and the shock wave here is created and propagates outward in both directions. And once you get substantial distance away from the bullet trajectory, i.e. this distance, then what has happened is that the form of this wave between here and here has changed, and between here and here, and also there, and so the entire width of it is expanding. That is, as the wave travels away from its source, it expands in duration. And so the diameter, the reasons for the shape of this waveform are a function of bullet speed, the velocity of the bullet, and the diameter of the bullet, and the speed of sound. So if you capture that shock wave close, then you can relate these peaks and valleys to these three variables. But the further away from that you get, because of that expansion, then it less accurately reflects those things. And that's where that myth comes from. Realistically, if I'm in a quiet room or on a quiet area in the outdoors, I'm going to be able to hear the shock wave jolly probably 500 feet away. It really just is a function of how big the bullet is, how fast it's traveling, what the speed of sound is, that determines what I can hear. The ear itself can distinguish different intensities of the same frequency down to 6 dB, which means that a 1 kilohertz signal at 20 dB can be differentiated from a 1 kilohertz signal at 26 dB. And that corresponds roughly to, well, I won't explain the decibel scale, but let's just say it's a fairly significant increase in intensity. The bullets themselves for a 223 will produce a shock wave at about 145 decibels. Okay, and so if you're in a screaming environment with, where somebody is screaming, like was in the venue, and the people are screaming at 90 decibels, then it's pretty clear you're going to be able to hear that signal, because there's a 55 decibel difference, and that's way larger than 6. But if you're out at the Oasis Apartments, for example, where the shock waves has had to travel 1,000 feet or more, and it's dropped down because along the way it's going to lose its intensity and spread out, and so it's going to, that 145 decibel signal may actually drop down to, let's say 36 decibels. Okay. And someone talking very quietly might be 42 decibels. Now these are just examples. I'd have to actually look up what the real values are. Okay, so we see that in this case we have a negative 6 decibels, and since we needed a positive 6 to hear it, then we're not probably going to hear it. It's still there, it's still recorded, and with sensitive equipment or the spectrograms, I can detect difference in sounds at 90 dB, at a minus 90 dB, if they don't occupy the same space and time. So with the proper equipment, I can detect things that you'd never even imagine that you could hear. But for hearing, that 6 decibel number is real critical. So once again, over here in a noisy environment, it takes a lot louder signal to be heard than over here. So in this case, to rise above the 42 decibel talking, I'd need a 48. So if I had a 48 decibel sound shock wave, then I'd be able to hear it. All things get recorded. Most recorders have 100, 120 decibel dynamic range with automatic gain control, so they can extend that range another 100 dBs in some cases, and the net effect is that all the sounds get compressed into a smaller range so that there's distortion, but yet you still get some of the signal recorded. So hearing and recordings are two different things. Hearing and spectrograms are two different things. Hearing and waveforms are two different things. So when people come along and say the shock wave can't be heard more than 200 feet, that's really a non sequitur statement, because whether you hear it or not is dependent upon the background noise compared to the signal level. Okay? And that sound doesn't just magically disappear once the shock wave is created. It continues to travel on until all of its energy is absorbed by the air molecules. And even then, at the subatomic level, there's still some residual energy, but you can't really detect that with your standard run-of-the-mill street equipment. Alright, so back to the shock wave itself. So we've kind of seen how they're created. We talked about noise levels and whether you can hear them. We've talked about the fact that the sounds have a life separate from the bullet. So if you're coming along and somebody's told you that you can only have, you can't get the shock wave noise recorded and kill people at the same time, well, that's just not true, because obviously the bullet movement and the shock wave are two different things. The shock wave is created by the passage of the bullet, which continues to pass and hit as many objects as it can while the shock wave is there, and the shock wave continues to live long after the bullet has passed until it dissipates over time. Alright, so let's go back and I'll explain a few other details about this, and then we'll call it a wrap. So let's rerun this. Alright. What do you want to do in this case? In this case, we want to let it run a while. And I'm going to... Okay. So here we are. We got created that cone, and it's just, you can see it's nice and smooth, and these little zaggedy lines are an artifact of the lighting. So let's talk about the speed of the bullet, okay, divided by the speed of sound. And that's typically what we call the Mach number, big M. Okay, so if your bullet's traveling at 3,000 feet per second, let's say, and your speed of sound is 1,000, then our Mach number is going to be 3. I'll just write right here. So what that says is, and this guy Whittem, he calculated that the ratio of these two numbers determines the slope of this line. And what he said, that if you draw a line along the path of the bullet like that, and then you measure the angle on either side of that bullet path like that. Now remember, this is a 2D representation of a 3D phenomena. Then he said the angle, or the inner angle there, which we'll call theta, is given by the trigonometric function of the Mach number. And he basically said that 1 over the Mach number, and let's erase the 3 there because I need room to write. He said the Mach number, 1 over the Mach number, and you take the arc sine of it, which means you take the inverse function of that trigonometric function called sine, and we write it like sine to the -1, and then we put that all in parentheses, and that will give us theta. Okay, now I don't have a calculator on me, but what that really says that for a bullet traveling at 3,000 feet per second, speed of sound of 1,000, you have a Mach number of 3, and 1 over 3 is 0.333, and if you take the inverse sine of that, this is angle there, so I don't know, somewhere like 23 degrees, I think, or maybe it's 30 degrees. Okay, and the Mach angle determines the slope of the cone. So that's all fine and dandy. Of course, you know, once the bullet stops, then the cone stops being generated, and while the shock waves and cone front are already there, continue to propagate in the same angle, there's no new ones, so you can't even really talk about that at past the point where the bullet stopped, except for the prior waves which propagate. It's also important to note that, you know, bullets don't stay at a constant velocity, and therefore this angle, as the bullet slows down, increases out like that until you reach Mach 1, at which it is essentially perpendicular to the travel of the bullet. And of course, you know, the bullet itself doesn't travel in a straight line either. It travels in a hyperbolic path. You know, where if you had a straight line here, firing straight out, you know, it would typically rise up. If you're firing on flat land, unlike what was happening at Mandalay Bay, and at a substantial distance, you have to shoot above that flat elevated plane, because the bullet doesn't travel in a straight line. It goes above it a little bit and then comes down, and this is typically what they call the 0 point, and that's where you adjust your scope to, and you can adjust it at any yardage. And as the distance increases, the bullet gets slower, and you have to increase the adjust your scope to compensate for that. Alright, that's probably enough technical detail. So let's go ahead and erase all that. And let's see, what else do I need to talk about here? The common sense things. We've covered that sound and bullets have a separate life of their own. We've covered what happens when the bullet stops. We've covered Mach angles. We've covered muzzle blasts, however it's always secondary in arrival time. Oh yeah, I guess now I can tie it all together. If you remember, I'll kind of draw a picture here. If you remember, and I'll draw it right on top of this, you remember the lag plot that I did. By measuring lags, we came up with something that kind of looked like this. Alright. And what that lag told us was that if the bullet is traveling along through this, right there, like that's the path of the bullet, then there we go, almost close. Oh, that's too big. The white line is the trajectory of the bullet, and the source of everything is somewhere right in here. And what it says that at locations close to the source, this yellow ball is close to the green balls and overtakes them soon. But the further out you get along here, the bullet's had time to travel, and it's traveling faster than the muzzle cone can expand, or muzzle sphere can expand. And so it takes a long time for that sphere to catch up to and overtake these shock waves. So along this direction, then the lag increases. Alright? And the other phenomena is, and we call that the downrange. So this is downrange. Downrange, downrange. And I'm going to be using that a lot downrange. And I'll even go cursive for downrange. So the downrange is along the path of the bullet. If I go cross range, that'll be the distance either direction. And you'll notice that this whole graph is symmetrical about the path of the bullet. So then you have cross range. And these are the two measurements that can be used to estimate the lag. And I'm going to estimate it here because you need to get it ground into your minds that it's this yellow part of the bullet that produces the muzzle wave, and the green part that is the shock wave front. And oh yeah, I know the other thing we should go over. And it takes a while for the yellow part, which is traveling and expanding at the speed of sound, to catch up to the green part, which was created at the speed of the bullet. Oftentimes 3 times quicker than that. Now once the green shock wave is created and the bullet's gone by, it too expands out at the speed of sound. So there's 3 components in determining when the green wave arrives at a particular point and when the yellow wave arrives at a particular point. But in general, the further away from the path of the bullet you are, that is, the larger the cross range distance, or miss distance as it's sometimes called, the less the lag, because the distance is let's see, I guess I'll do it with blue. If we have a point, let's say pick a point out here somewhere, alright, then the distance for the muzzle blast to travel is that distance. Okay. The shock wave will be produced probably, I know this isn't a scale, but let's say right there. So the bullet travels from, let's call this point A, and this point B. So the bullet travels from point A to point B. It emits one of these little green shock waves, and then that shock wave, traveling at the speed of sound, grows and grows and grows until it too reaches that. So we've got multiple components here now to think about. And we have the time that the bullet travels, we have the time that the green shock waves travel, and we have the time that the muzzle travels. And as you can see, every location produces a different geometry. And if you're along the bullet path, then this little vector here becomes 0, i.e. the travel time of the shock wave is essentially 0 along the bullet path, and therefore the time of arrival of the shock wave is strictly the time of the travel of the bullet. And that's the condition under which the health ranger would have been true. His statements would have been true, and only true, and only if the bullet was a constant velocity bullet, which they rarely are. But but once you leave the path of the bullet, then health ranger's statement about lag is wrong. And so for one bullet you can have as many lags calculations as there are different recording locations. And but when you think about it in terms of the yellow muzzle wave originating back there and expanding outward, blah 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 blah, and then the shock wave being created right here at that little red point, and then doing the same thing, expanding out and out and out, then you can get an idea that when they arrive there, X marks the spots, then that's the time of arrival for each, and the time, and the difference between them is the lag, and that if you have a different location, then that whole thing changes. So that's probably enough scribbling, and probably enough thing. So let's just run it once more so that you can see some of those effects. because they're not obvious, they're not intuitive, and it takes a lot of repetition to get this stuff under control in our minds. But I've given you enough detail here that it shouldn't be magic anymore. Yeah, you know, it can be to calculate some of these things, particularly in reverse. That is, if you have a certain lag, you know, what's the position on the trajectory of the bullet, where that corresponding shock wave is produced. Those are difficult calculations. Very difficult. Going forward is a little easier if you know the bullet speed and all that. You can say that, you know, calculate that stuff. Anyway, let's have it hit something, let it run. Yes, I did say run, didn't I? Come on, baby, I know you can do it. Oh, well, let's rerun it then. Oh, I don't even have it on the... Dumb me. Alright, hit, run, and there you can see what that shape looks like if the bullet hits something. The sound's still there, it still works, whatnot. Let's run it again, and this time we're not going to hit anything. And then we're going to get up close and we're going to step through it, and we'll see the formation and creation of the supersonic shock cone by the addition of multiple shock waves, which are nothing more than spheres, but they interact in such a way that the greatest loudness occurs along the front of this, and inside the cone and behind the cone there's little volume. In fact, anything to the left of the green part here is probably not going to be audible. Could be recorded, but such a low volume that, you know, most people just consider it to be non-existent, because this wavefront's moving outward, not backwards. But the individual shock waves that are spheres still have enough intensity to be heard when you're close. So anyway, you see the angle forming, it gets smoother the greater the number of things are, and if we just let it run amok, you know, then it eventually fades out of existence. As you can see, it's moving to the left, and I shrink it down here. Moves left, the original parts grow weaker and weaker, and the sounds are dominated by the shock wave. Whereas early on, you know, the muzzle wave, the yellow part, was very visible because it was equally as strong as those initial shock waves. And, you know, that's another consideration there, is the ratio of the intensity of the shock wave to the intensity of the muzzle wave, and those vary by location and temperature and all that sort of stuff. And so it can be quite the experience, particularly as in Vegas, where there are multiple rounds going off per second, because this is just one doing its thing. Imagine having 10 per second for 10 seconds, the number of waves and everything. Alright, so I think I've given everybody enough to think about, and we'll grab you in the next video.